Welcome, everyone. Seems like a very august podium for a very friendly crowd, so I'll keep my remarks as well brief and friendly. I'm Radhika Subramaniam. I'm the director and curator of the Sheila Johnson Design Center at Parsons, also a faculty member in the Art and Design History and Theory School, and I'm actually really delighted to be collaborating with a colleague in another school of Parsons in order to bring together a conversation about urbanisms that may be rather more surprising than even Parsons has been used to. At least I like to think that our collaboration has set in motion for us here a series of new dialogues using the provocation of this remarkable book edited by Vinayak Bharne, The Emerging Asian City, from which we have two other collaborators aside from Asim, Jeff Hu, and Robert Cowherd, who have graciously come to initiate these conversations with us. When we were thinking about putting this symposium together, one of the directions that we were very strongly interested in encouraging in terms of what this conversation could mean here at the New School and at Parsons was to bring together people who have been thinking about cities for a very long time, but not as urbanists or traditional urban designers, but who might be anthropologists, photographers, graphic designers, curators, artists, all of whom are concerned very deeply with urban space and with emerging Asian urban spaces, but perhaps not from the traditional provinces of urban design or architecture, to which sometimes we are forced to cede this authority. So I am particularly delighted that all four contributors to the volume, and the editor included, were so gracious as to take up this conversation with us here, because we certainly have been talking about this for a while and are thrilled to be in conversation with you. So I won't lose much time. I'm just going to do very brief introductions of everyone as the panels begin. But right now, I want to introduce Vinayak Bharne, who will be giving us an opening keynote, framing the book and some of its debates. He has been working with Asim Anam on the Emerging Cities book. He's joint adjunct faculty at the Saul Price School of Public Policy and the School of Architecture at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and is the director of design at Moule and Polyzoides, I hope that's pronounced correctly, Architects and Urbanists. He is co-author of Rediscovering the Hindu Temple, the Sacred Architecture and Urbanism of India, recently published, 2012, and a contributing author to several books, including Planning Los Angeles and The Aesthetics of Sustainable Architecture. Vinayak, over to you. Thank you.
This is in many ways a truly remarkable event. What are the chances of having a live stream from New York with participants from New York and many other cities in the United States, centered and anchored on the subject of Asian cities and being transmitted all over the world? I mean, that's quite an impressive accomplishment in itself. So I'm delighted to be here, very privileged to be here. And I'd like to begin by thanking the two organizers of this event, because I think taking the time to arrange something as complex as this and as sophisticated as this is no small task. So thank you to both of you. I want to begin by going back about 6 years ago, when the genesis of this book, the foundations of this book, which is sort of a springing board, not really the thrust of the discussion today at all, but a springing point for this discussion, happened kind of serendipitously with my friend Asim Anam. We were having lunch in Pasadena, and the lunch turned into a very significant discussion on the contemporary condition of how urbanism is being thought about, what cities mean to us, and what is really going on in the larger rubric of cities and engaging with cities. And a number of points emerged that we contemplated on with Jeff Howe, Robert Cowherd, many others who sort of came together and stayed on this journey patiently to craft what was a 5.5-year effort to produce, I think, a truly remarkable book that could never have been produced, I would argue, by a single mind or a single hand. So I want to talk about some of these ideas that propelled this book and laid the foundations for what we truly believe is the beginnings of a much larger dialogue in this regard. I think one dimension of this book is really to bridge a gap between the silos of academia and practice. There is still very strangely a line, however invisible that may be, between books that are coming out, extremely sophisticated books on Asia, which I would argue has no shortage of attention today. But as all of us who contributed to this book, who are in some way or the other involved out in the field and in the academy, there is a little bit of a tension, because many of these brilliant books that are written by sort of franchised academics, and what I mean by that is, you know, you're on your tenure and you sort of compulsorily talk about jargon and high theory, which is wonderful, and I applaud it. It's a privilege to simply be in their presence and read these amazing books. The tension for me is when you're on the outside of the academy, much of the impact and the influence such books have is rather minimal. And that was an observation that was extremely important for me personally, because the deeper reflections on what Asian cities mean, or how to engage with them, was not really percolating into a whole section of urbanists which were doing increasing work in Asia. So one of the very difficult efforts of this book was to try and get all these incredible thinkers together who were in their own way doing extraordinary research on urbanism on the other side of the world, but to challenge them, to convince them, and to probably even force them in some ways to not take away the sophistication of their ideas, but try and make it much more approachable to a larger audience. The second was that this book, we tried very hard to make it a bridge between two polarized attitudes to Asia and perhaps to even other cities in the world. There is one attitude which is particularly argued by many academics, and they are right in their own way, that with the kind of fluidity we have today, cross-cultural fluidity, the very idea of Asia as a political, as a sort of a perceptual entity is itself a question. You know, there are Chinese who are forming entire cities in other parts of the world. There are ethnic communities that are in flux between continents. Where does one draw the line between what Asia is? Where does one draw the line between what Asian means? So there is this constant tension in the academy, which is almost polemicized to the extreme degree, that the very fact that you talk about Asian might be problematic. And while they might be right in one way, there is the other extreme, which is academics who focused almost their entire lives in a reductivist attitude, which is to dissect Asia into regional identities. So on the one hand, you take a portion of Asia called South Asia, and they are not entirely wrong either, because the lens and the prism that they use to understand Asia is on the basis of a contemporary culture, probably without looking at many of the other nuances that come through it. So this sort of deconstructivist attitude to cut Asia into various pieces is another extreme polarity. And what we tried to do as we discussed all this is we asked the question, well, couldn't it be a both and? Why should it be an either or? Couldn't Asia be much more complex than all this? And so what the book tries to do is, instead of sort of arguing on a linear path, it tries to murk these ideas in the hope of provoking a bigger discussion on what Asia means and how to engage with it. The third agenda of the book is to reread Asia itself as an extension of the second point, as an intertwined phenomenon between what we are calling urbanities and urbanisms. And these are terms that may be subjective in various regards, but in the context of this book, urbanities refers to traits of urban life, phenomena of urban life that are intangible. They are not products, but they are the idea of the city as a flowing phenomenon. They refer to polarizations, economic polarizations, social landscapes, anthropological findings. The second part is urbanisms, which in this case refers to the products, the tangible city, which is often both the result of these forces, but also in turn influencing these forces. So they're intertwined, they're concomitant. And the idea of this book was to traverse these complex landscape of Asia and argue that what these authors, what these scholars are eventually telling us is that these forces are intertwined, they're murky, and they're neither isolated nor are they regionally unique. And that's sort of the argument this book tries to make. The fourth agenda of this book is a rather simple one, which is to capture the sheer breadth and complexity of Asia. The essays in this book, there are 24 chapters, they stretch all the way from Mongolia to Indonesia, from Jakarta to Ulaanbaatar, and all the way from Damascus to Tokyo. They talk about various socio-cultural issues. They have themes that lurk behind one another. It's difficult to draw lines between one section of the book. It's difficult to draw lines between the argument one essay makes versus another, which proves to you that there's a greater complexity and a nuance to Asia that cannot really be oversimplified. And the fifth agenda, and perhaps there are many more, is to simply provoke a very important question, and that is, are Asian cities eventually treading a different path to their futures? Are Asian landscapes similar but also different from the kind of landscapes we indulge ourselves, particularly in the Western world, particularly in the United States, where we wrote this book, where most of the contributors are from, in Europe as well. So one of the things we tried to do is invite authors from various backgrounds. We had authors from academia and practice, from East and West, people who had lived in Asia, people who had lived in Asia but now returned to the United States, immigrated to the United States, all muddled up into trying and capturing various perspectives of what Asian landscapes truly mean. So what I want to do is now very briefly take you through some of the ideas of this book in a slightly more visceral way, as with the preface I've just given, and really show you some of the ingredients which will form, I hope, a larger basis for the discussion to follow. And I want to begin with these two slides, because these two, I give them in almost every lecture to my classes, and it remains sort of the raison for this book for me. The drawing that you see below is the famous Noli Plan. It was done in 1748 by Giovan Battista Noli in Rome. It's a much celebrated drawing in the urbanist architectural world. And what it did, very simply, is it was an extraordinary drawing. It was a mapping, a survey, a reading of the city post-Renaissance Rome, when Rome had re-emerged as a Christian city. Michelangelo was building many of his projects, but what Noli did, he morphologically equated history. He did not distinguish the buildings as part of different historic periods. He equated it and prioritized the idea of a city as an artifact between public and private space, public and private life. There were many subtexts that many authors have interpreted. That's very well known. What is not very well known is at the exact same time, or almost the exact same time, there was a simultaneous mapping going on in the city of Kyoto in Japan, which was called the Rakuchu Rakugai Meishu Zoo. And what it did is, instead of capturing the city in sort of this cartographic precision of morphology, they were not interested in that. The idea of the city was subservient to the fleeting events of life. So these beautiful pictograms, almost impressionist in nature, were shrouded by clouds, because the idea was not to capture the physical form of the city, but to capture the rituals and the change. The idea of the city as an event in time, a phenomenon in constant flux. And it's very important to understand these juxtapositions. It's not that Asia is contemplated or Japan contemplated one thing and West the other. The fact is, it's both and. It's urbanities and urbanism. It's the products and processes that make cities together as a whole. So what this book tries to do in a gist is reread Asia as a series of confluences, social confluences, political confluences, cultural confluences, that intertwined with each other, that created lineages, linkages, ancestries, legacies, and sort of provoke the argument that it's kind of simplistic and naive to think that different parts of Asia are simply different or exclusively different. They're not necessarily only different, they are also similar. So the question was, where do they overlap? Where do they differ? How do you understand these? And therefore, how do you engage with them? So the thrust of the book, at least in the introduction, spells out what these various essays eventually capture, which is a series of phenomenological landscapes, urbanisms, which are tangible, but eventually formed by phenomenological forces that are extremely different from each other. What are some of these? One of the earliest ones are what we call virgin landscapes. These landscapes were indigenous to their places. They never had any external influence. This is the Ganga Puja in Kashi, Varanasi, one of the oldest cities in the world, the oldest cities alive in the world. This is a contemporary of the Acropolis, but it's teeming with the same Hindu rituals as 3,000 years ago. The diagram you see on top is a pilgrimage path through the holy Hindu city. And what it reminds us is there are other ways of reading cities. There are cognitive ways which go beyond the physical form of the city into religious experiences, socio-semantic experiences, which transcend and challenge our conventional reading of what cities truly mean. The second landscapes that you find in Asia, and they are scattered across Asia in space and time, are landscapes that emerged out of cross-cultural trajectories. For example, Buddhism was a trajectory that went from its Indian roots, almost suppressed itself in India, and went all the way and proliferated in China, Japan, and so on and so forth. So you have these amazing cities and landscapes that are founded on certain sociocultural beliefs that emerge from somewhere else. The city of Shangan, one of the biggest cities of its time, the first major metropolis in the Asian world, became the predecessor of Kyoto. The plan of Kyoto was actually morphologically a replica of Shangan. And this slide is a poignant one because you have Taj Mahal, which you can see today as a building in itself, a world-famous building. But the lineage of this building actually traces back 4 centuries to the original mausoleum of Guru Amir in Samarkand. And along the Silk Route, this beautiful trajectory finds its way into the Indian subcontinent, finds its way over 3 generations of Mughal emperors, and eventually, teleologically concludes in the magnificent Taj Mahal. So it reminds us that every piece of landscape in various parts of Asia has complex histories that deserve attention and that begin to draw lines that might not be visible today, but need to be essentially understood as clues to other subtexts that might not easily be dominant. The third is colonizations. This is the first East-West dialectic. The earliest visitors to Asia is, of course, the Greeks, but their influence doesn't last much. From an urbanist standpoint, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, and colonization is an amazing phenomenon which unifies Asia, because it's almost like a sociocultural asteroid, that sort of a series of asteroids that emerges and bombards itself into native landscapes across Asia. So you have Gao, the slide to the right at the bottom. This is when you look at it's in Sri Lanka. When you look at Gao from a distance, it almost looks like a Basti town, but in the tropics. But when you go closer, you begin to see that every house, every street, every construction technique is actually native. The form of the house may be alien, may be a replica of the original colonial landscapes, but the method and the means are completely indigenous. So where does one draw the line from today's standpoint between how we understand colonization? Colonization can be understood as tyranny, a phenomenon that actually imposed itself on a native trajectory, and that's fair, on a native population. But when you look at it another way, it also gave us a lot of things. It created new infrastructure. It created progress in some countries, which they're proud of, as this book really shows. So we have a section in this book called tensions, a word that may not necessarily be only negative. And the authors in this book really capture this idea, that the idea of tensions, both as colonization and beyond, is really a series of interactions that has multifarious manifestations, not necessarily one. The fourth landscape is what we now see through self-imposed westernizations. There's a time when some countries in Asia, some places in Asia, almost embrace early westernization as the path to progress. One of the most distinct ones is actually in Japan. The movie The Last Samurai makes it extremely distinct. 1886, the Meiji era, when you have a young emperor who's not really in a position to make important decisions, and you have a sort of a manipulating set of people around him who begin to believe very strongly that westernization, the gun, the agenda of Western technology will bring a kind of progress that the country has not seen. And China, Japan, many other countries viscerally manifest this in their landscape. So the slide to the upper left is one of the first consciously Western designed landscapes in the Asian world. It is the street of Ginza, which is the original silversmith district in Tokyo that was demolished in the earthquake. And the British architect Thomas Walters is actually brought in consciously to design a Western replication of a streetscape, becoming the first such paradigm in the Far East. Well, things go further. When China decides to become a different kind of country, you have Mao Zedong and other proclamations that use Moscow's example, precedents of the West, bringing in policies and land use plans that begin to understand the city in a completely different way. So the West, beyond colonization, now becomes a very important socio-political agenda that begins to get perceived as the canvas for progress. The fifth one, of course, is the most dominant one, which is modernism, the conscious and franchised embrace of modern architecture and urbanism. 4 years after the British, the largest colonial empire in the world, and they depart from India, Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, commissions Le Corbusier, perhaps the greatest living architect of its time, to design his largest project. And what is very interesting in this regard is, on the one hand, India becomes a democracy. It embraces democracy. But on the other hand, you have a person like Nehru who arguably does not take the vision of Corbusier through the litmus test of the public. And this happens in many countries. This happens in Islamabad in Pakistan, so many others. The idea of a franchised elite beginning to think that the torchbearers of a progress would actually be the same people that they gained independence from, which is the Westerners. So you invite the greatest Western names to now chart a whole other agenda towards modernity and modernism, which will give you, catapult you to instant international attention. And that remains a very fascinating tension, which is also captured in this book in the second section. The sixth landscape is what we now call the offsprings of modernity. Here, with the sudden rapid urbanization of cities all across Jakarta, Dhaka, many other places all across Asia, Damascus, we see a constant phenomenon now where there is a parallel alternative modernity that emerges. Here we have landscapes like slums, like squatters, like refugee camps, which create, on the one hand, unhygienic conditions, so to say, but on the other hand, colossal economies, alternative microeconomies that cannot be ignored. So what is the place of these alternative economies? How do we grapple with it? What is their promise in our engagement with Asian cities? This is one of the questions the book seeks to ask. The seventh landscape is the rural landscapes that are being mercilessly absorbed in the pace of rapid urbanization. Here you find ethnic tribes. Asia has indigenous, the villages of Borneo, the disappearing urban villages of Guangzhou, the rice fields of Bali. I mean, these are rapidly disappearing. What does this mean? What does this mean for Asia and for several cities across Asia as a phenomenon that on the one hand begs the question of social equity and humanitarianism, and the other perhaps is inevitable for many on the road to progress. The eighth landscape is what we call the ambivalent reception of modernism. There are many cities, many places all over Asia where scenarios like this, visions like this, almost throw a gauntlet at you into seeming anachronistic on one hand. This is almost like a medieval port for another time. This is Shahjahanabad, the Mughal city of Old Delhi, which was built circa in the mid-1600s. And if you go there today in one of the streets, you almost transport it to a medieval time frame. It almost seems like the infrastructure, the way of life, the dressing of the people, the way they carry themselves, it leads you almost to think that it's almost like another time frame compared to the ones we're usually used to. But the question that this book asks is it really? Is it truly an anachronism, or is it part of the larger agenda of what contemporary urbanism truly means? So what these landscapes challenge you to think of is how modernity becomes a much broader, challenged word within many Asian cities and what to do about it. The ninth landscape is Asia's instant cities, or what we call Asia's sudden cities. Here, there is a constant echo that one sees, almost making it a cyclic phenomenon, if you can call it so. So you have Tokyo that booms in the 60s at the peak of the Japanese economy. You have Kuala Lumpur, you have Hong Kong in the 70s, you have Shenzhen in the 90s, you have Dubai in the 90s. So there's a constant echo of the same rapid urbanization phenomenon which happens in different parts of Asia, proving that while their cultural identities may be unique or different, there are also certain pan-Asian phenomena that unify them and where they overlap. Here one begins to think of another subtext, which is, unlike the kind of urbanization, pace of urbanization that we in the United States and probably European nations are used to, one of the reasons that these places, these countries have been able to engender, perhaps even sustain, perhaps even permit such pace, a sheer pace of urbanization such as the one we have never seen, is partly because of different power structures, partly because of different governance structures, partly because of very different expectations or intentions of what urban life or cities are in the first place. So how do we step back and begin to understand them on their own terms rather than our own terms is another question this book posits. The 10th landscape is what we are now seeing as new emerging trends, which are now bringing in other prerogatives. Sustainability, there are non-utopian planning incremental schemes. Here one finds things like Putrajaya, Kuala Lumpur's 11,000-acre brand built from scratch city. We find a lot of green cities that are being promoted in China, Dongtan, many others that are claiming zero carbon emissions and so on and so forth. The efficacy of these proposals waits to be seen. But the fact is that they are challenging many of the normative trends that Asia has seen over the last few years. The slide to the upper part of this collection is the Saadiyat Island in Abu Dhabi, one of the most ambitious projects currently under construction. And what is amazing about it is the unabashed invitation of 4 of the world's greatest architects to design 4 amazing buildings, some of them as prestigious commissions. You have Frank Gehry designing the Guggenheim Museum, Jean Nouvel doing the Louvre, Zaha Hadid, and then Tadawando designing major museums in a part of the world like Abu Dhabi, which many might argue is appropriate on the one hand in the situation of sort of globalization and having global identities that don't necessarily belong to the UAE but belong to the rest of the world. But the bigger question the book provokes in one of the chapters is, while these may be global agendas, should we forget that they also have a local agenda? And what is that local agenda? And how do we talk about the both and rather than an either or? The slide to the bottom is Thamestown, which has been criticized unabashedly as a veneer of Bristol, as a veneer of a British town in China. The question the book asks and sort of provokes in another way is that the only lens that we can lend to examining places like this? Or should we also judge them through other lenses like their performance standards, for example? Why should Thamestown only be looked at as a veneer of another country, of another culture? Perhaps, if looked closer, you might find other forms of community life that were non-existent in these places themselves. So there might be other lenses that we might understand Asia through and Asian phenomena through. So it's a very complex landscape. How do we capture it in a book that is limited by pages, authors, minds, thoughts? So instead of making it topical, instead of making it place-based, instead of making it period-based, instead of making it encyclopedic, what we eventually landed up doing through our collective discussions is to bring it down to 3 contingent lenses, broad lenses, which actually capture thematic ideas under which each of these amazing authors could actually posit very unabashedly on what they believed were many times conflicting viewpoints in different places across Asia. So there's a section called 10 Traditions, which is the first part of the book, which actually says there is a side of the Asian landscape, a side where we want to engage, which actually offers us direct antipodes to the modernity of Asian cities. If on the one hand, the conventional definition of modernity is advanced infrastructure, shimmering skylines, a more sophisticated understanding of technology, mass communication, there are other sides, millions of them scattered across Asia, where literally there's a gauntlet thrown at you because these people are the antipodian opposite. How do we engage with them? What are the issues facing these landscapes? What do they teach us? What do they mean? The second is called tensions. Now, the idea of tensions is not so much to explore the histories of colonial and modern landscapes as much as to test their legacies. The question that the tension section asks is, almost 50 years have passed, almost half a century has gone by since several places in Asia who are under colonial powers attained sovereignty. And in their sort of rampage to get onto the world stage, some of them either flaunted their colonial legacies or rejected them and invited modern legacies. So if you pit colonialism and modernism together, there's a lot of commonality between them. The first commonality is, if you look at many places in Asia, as this book argues, both agendas were thrust onto the local population. Many times they were not really asked. The local population was not really given a chance in many Asian cities to ask whether they wanted these kind of modernities. It was thrust upon them. Maybe not so in all places, but maybe certainly in some. What are the legacies of these imposed, insinuated, impregnated landscapes? Have they been rejected? Have they been embraced? Have they been assimilated? What has come out of them? And how do we engage with this as a phenomenon that is quite different from the one we see before? And the third section of the book talks about transformations, which is, it actually argues that Asia now, parts of Asia, are creating new identities that are distinctly Asian. They are not Western. Their seeds were Western. Their birth was Western. But the umbilical cord has been cut a long time ago. You cannot see Kuala Lumpur as an extension of a Western city. Hong Kong may be a hyper Manhattan, but it is also its own identity. It is Hong Kong. It does not have the Manhattan grid. Tokyo does not have a grid to begin with. The very process through which Tokyo emerges is the antithesis of any Western or European city. How do you understand these new identities? What do they mean? And how do you actually talk about this and engage with them? The reason these three were important was another one. By sort of creating a sort of tripartite structure, it was also our way of creating a sort of a neutral framework, or a framework that tries to become neutral. And this was our challenge to many books out there, which try to sort of bias, conveniently bias, either a nostalgic stance on Asia, or a completely sort of non-nostalgic stance on Asia, or a completely post-colonial stance on Asia. And while we respect them, and they've served as enormous inspiration for this book, the real gauntlet this book throws out to practitioners, to academics, to thinkers, to sociologists is, how can we understand Asia as a both and? How can we capture all of this together? So this is what this book is about. The discussion, of course, goes far beyond this book into what the very idea of urbanities and urbanism means. And I hope that this will serve as a foundation for a very provocative discussion today. So thank you, Asim. Thank you, Radhika. And let's get the ball rolling. Thank you.